May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Across the world, church bells rang, flags waved, and crowds filled streets in a euphoric haze. But at Camp Avery, a small American prisoner of war facility, nestled in the pine-covered outskirts of Arkansas, a quieter scene unfolded. There were no parades, no champagne, and certainly no dancing. Instead, trays clattered, ovens hummed, and an unfamiliar scent wafted through the halls, sweet, smoky, and suspiciously tropical. It was pizza day. The camp had been home to 63 Italian women, all captured from various outposts across North Africa and southern Italy. Auxiliary Corps, radio operators, field nurses, none of them combatants, but all marked by uniform and affiliation. Their transition to captivity had been quiet, defined more by confusion than resistance. They kept to themselves, sang softly in their native tongue when guards were out of earshot, and maintained an air of disciplined detachment. But even the most composed among them were not prepared for what arrived that afternoon. Private Harold Monroe, a man with more stomach than sense, had been assigned mess hall duty for the week. He was from Ohio, where his mother made a weekly treat she proudly called Freedom Pie, a creation of leftover ham, canned pineapple chunks, and excessive amounts of cheese laid atop thick American bread. Inspired by his patriotic upbringing and unaware of the international stakes involved, Monroe had written home asking for the full recipe. The result? 30 steaming trays of what he believed to be a cultural gift, a peace offering in the form of a warm, golden crust. When the food was served, the women were cautious at first. Plates were placed, forks handed out, and the usual tension filled the room. Then, slowly, the scent began to register. Anna Bellini, a former Red Cross volunteer from Naples, was the first to lean over her tray, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Across the table, Lucia Ferretti, who had not spoken in 2 weeks, muttered something under her breath. A prayer or a curse, it wasn't clear. But it was Carla Moretti who broke the silence. 26 years old, daughter of a Sicilian baker, and proud inheritor of 4 generations of pizza-making tradition. She had survived bombings, typhus, and 3 failed escape attempts. But nothing could have prepared her for this. As she stared down at the bubbling cheese, the wet yellow cubes, the pink slices of ham, her face contorted into a shape not even war had drawn out of her. One hand flew to her cheek, her mouth fell open, and a gasp escaped that seemed to echo off the stone walls. Behind her, 2 women burst into tears. Private Monroe, beaming with pride, mistook the reaction for joy. "It's a Hawaiian, sweet and salty. The boys love it back home," Carla whispered, only 4 words. "This is an attack." And with that, the first slice was cut, not by a knife, but by the sharp edge of cultural betrayal. The women had arrived in early March, shipped in under gray skies and quiet orders. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but for these 63 Italian prisoners, the real battle was just beginning. Camp Avery sat like a forgotten square on a giant chessboard, tucked into the pines and fog of rural Arkansas, its wooden barracks weathered by southern rains and war-weary indifference. Most of the guards barely spoke to the women. Orders were clear: keep them safe, keep them fed, keep them contained. The women, for their part, obeyed, outwardly. They walked in pairs, lined up at chow, and folded laundry with silent precision. Their uniforms were faded, patches half-stitched, some still clinging to the insignia of a country that no longer quite existed. Among them was Sergeant Bianca Romano, 31 years old, and the highest-ranking woman in the group. Bianca had been an airfield dispatcher outside Palermo, known for her steel gaze and fluent German. Now she found herself standing in line for powdered eggs beside farm boys from Kansas and North Dakota. She kept the women organized. She rationed their letters home, translated orders, and kept their quarters in a state of near-military tidiness. But even Bianca couldn't stop the slow seep of boredom and uncertainty that came with captivity. The women passed time by braiding each other's hair, drawing chalk maps in the dirt of places they'd never see again, or trading stories of what they'd left behind. Vineyards, sons, secrets. The camp kitchen, however, remained a source of escalating anxiety. The food was unpredictable. One week it was boiled potatoes and dried sausage. The next, a concoction called cheeseburger surprise, which smelled vaguely of metal. Most of the women assumed the meals were either punishments or failed experiments. They rarely complained aloud, but in the quiet of the barracks, murmurs built like distant thunder. When Private Monroe appeared in early May, things changed. Young, broad-shouldered, and fueled by an unchecked sense of innovation, he took his kitchen assignment as a personal mission. He believed food could bridge nations. He saw himself as a culinary diplomat, destined to win the hearts of the enemy through melted cheese and American charm. On his first day, he brought them cornbread with marshmallows. On the second, scrambled eggs with canned peaches. The reactions ranged from blank stares to whispered threats in Sicilian dialects. Monroe, oblivious, took every grimace as a challenge to do better. And then he remembered the pineapple. To him, it was just pizza. Sweet, salty, hot, cheesy joy. But he did not know what he was about to unleash. To him, it was a meal. To them, it was sacrilege. In the weeks to come, Monroe's pineapple pie would spark something ancient in the women, something older than war, deeper than hunger. It would begin, as all revolutions do, with a single silent vow: never again. The scent arrived before the tray. It was thick, humid, and sticky sweet, like syrup poured over ash. The women were seated as usual, 2 rows of worn benches under the dim glow of overhead bulbs, when the air shifted. Noses wrinkled, eyes narrowed. There was confusion at first, followed by a growing visceral dread. Something was coming, and it was not bread. Maria Esposito, who once worked in her uncle's trattoria in Naples, was the first to recognize the horror. She stiffened, stood halfway from her bench, and sniffed the air like a bloodhound on high alert. Then she sat back down, face pale. "No," she said under her breath. "No, they wouldn't." She was wrong. Private Monroe appeared moments later, pushing a metal cart with wheels that squeaked like mice in distress. On the trays, steaming discs of golden crust, shimmering under a thick layer of melted cheese. It could have been a miracle, if not for the speckled insult glistening on top. Chunks of canned pineapple, their juices seeping into the ham, the cheese, the very soul of the dough. "Fresh from the oven," Monroe declared with unearned pride. "I added extra pineapple just like my mama does." Silence met him like a wall. Not a single woman moved. Even the guards looked unsure. Bianca Romano stood slowly, the authority in her voice still sharp despite months of captivity. "Is this a punishment?" she asked. Monroe blinked. "Ma'am?" "This food," she said, gesturing without touching. "Is this retribution for something?" Monroe looked genuinely wounded. "No, ma'am. It's pizza, Hawaiian style. It's a treat. Thought you'd like it." From the back of the room, a fork clattered to the floor. Lucia covered her face. Georgia crossed herself. The mood had changed. Bianca leaned down, examining the pie as though it were a corpse. "In Italy," she said carefully, "we do not put fruit on pizza. It is forbidden." "Well," Monroe shrugged, "welcome to America." That was the moment the smell transformed. It was no longer food. It was an insult, a declaration of war masked in cheese. Carla Moretti, still pale from the shock of the first encounter, whispered, "They have no shame." Behind her, someone gagged. And yet, despite everything, the trays were served. Forks were handed out. The women sat frozen, not out of fear, but disbelief. A few brave ones poked at the slices. Some peeled the pineapple off with surgical precision. But most didn't touch the meal at all. The betrayal wasn't just culinary, it was spiritual. The sacred had been defiled. And while Monroe returned to the kitchen whistling, "God Bless America," the women sat in a stunned silence that said more than words ever could. They had survived war. But this was something else entirely. By nightfall, it was clear that something had to be done. Bianca called a quiet assembly inside Barracks 4, far from the ears of the American guards. Candles flickered in tin cups. Blankets were pinned over the windows. The mood was somber, militant. What had begun as a culinary shock was now a crisis of dignity. "This cannot continue," Bianca said firmly. "Today it was pineapple. Tomorrow? What then? Peanut butter pasta? Spaghetti with ketchup?" Gasps followed. "We must respond," said Carla, still visibly shaken. "The ancestors are watching." Maria nodded solemnly. "My great-grandmother once fed partisans during the Austro-Hungarian retreat. She would spit in the eye of this Hawaiian pie." They agreed unanimously. Something must be done. Thus was born Operation Canned Fruit. The plan was simple, elegant, and driven by spite. They would locate the supply of pineapple in the mess hall storage and remove it, quietly, permanently. Teresa, a quiet woman with nimble fingers and a background in locksmithing, was chosen as the point of entry. With a bent spoon and an old hairpin, she could open nearly any door in the camp. Bianca drew a map of the kitchen from memory. Georgia timed the guards' patrols down to the minute. They would strike just before dawn, when the kitchen was unstaffed and the soldiers sleepy. The next morning, the plan was executed with near-military precision. Teresa slipped through the back kitchen entrance while the others kept watch. Within minutes, she returned carrying 2 dented cans beneath her coat. "We got some," she whispered. Carla took one, stared at it as if holding a live grenade. "It's real," she said, "the poison." Over the next 3 nights, the women took turns sneaking into the kitchen, removing small amounts of pineapple and replacing them with decoy cans filled with peeled potatoes. By the end of the week, the pineapple supply had been reduced by over half. They stored the contraband in an unused laundry basket beneath the barracks floorboards, where it sat like cursed gold. But Monroe noticed. "Strange," he muttered aloud one afternoon, turning a can in his hand. "Didn't we have more of these?" No one answered. He narrowed his eyes, suspicion growing, but without proof he had no grounds to accuse. Still, he doubled the next order. The women were furious. "We are drowning in it," Georgia spat. "For every can we destroy, 2 more arrive." Bianca folded her arms. "Then we escalate." They would have to go bigger, bolder. Pineapple alone was no longer the problem. It was the idea that their tastes, their culture, could be overwritten. This was no longer a protest. It was a rebellion. And the next phase would not be quiet. It would be baked into history. Camp Avery was no longer quiet. What began as whispers and scowls over pineapple pizza had evolved into something far deeper, a cultural divide sharpened into factions. The Italian women, once united by their shared captivity, were now subtly fractured. A line had been drawn, not in blood, but in sauce. On one side stood the traditionalists. Led by Carla Moretti, they believed in the sanctity of dough, tomato, olive oil, and respect. Their motto, scribbled in chalk behind the barracks latrine, read, "No fruit shall touch the crust." They rejected the foreign toppings, refusing even to acknowledge the altered pies as pizza. For them, every tray from the mess hall was a reminder of lost heritage, of home tarnished by canned heresy. On the other side, a smaller group emerged, the adaptationists. Quiet at first, but emboldened by hunger and reluctant curiosity, they began picking around the pineapple, then occasionally eating small bites. A few even admitted they didn't hate it. Rosa Bonetti, a 23-year-old nurse from Venice, whispered to Lucia one evening, "It's not bad, it's warm. It reminds me of carnival sweets." She was promptly ignored for 3 days. The schism grew. Even mealtimes became theatrical. Traditionalists sat at one end of the hall bringing their own salvaged spices and scraps to transform their rations into palatable dishes. Adaptationists sat at the other, quietly chewing while dodging glares. Monroe, still proud of his creation, noticed the tension but misread it entirely. "They're probably fighting over the last slice," he joked to Private Denny. But the divide was real. Bianca, trying to hold the group together, called for calm. She argued they had bigger concerns than crust and canned fruit. They were prisoners in a foreign land. Their enemy wasn't cheese, it was isolation. But even her voice began to falter when Maria was caught scraping pineapple into the dirt like it was toxic waste. "She's burying it," Teresa whispered. "She says it needs to be purified by soil." The Americans, for their part, remained oblivious. Monroe continued baking. The guards, who once saw only uniformed women behind a fence, now saw something almost theatrical. Rumors spread of the Great Pizza War. One soldier drew caricatures of pineapple-wielding Italians battling dough-clad rebels. It was juvenile. It was also, unintentionally, accurate. The worst came when Rosa, the outspoken adaptationist, was caught sneaking into the kitchen at night, not to sabotage, but to ask Monroe for the recipe. The fallout was immediate. Carla called her a traitor. Lucia wept. Even Bianca refused to speak to her. "Your tongue may have surrendered," Carla spat, "but mine never will." That night Rosa slept alone in the corner of the barracks. What had started as a meal had turned into something far more dangerous, a crisis of identity. These women had survived war, loss, and exile, but this simple slice, had cracked open something deeper. Their enemy had not broken them with bullets. But crust? Crust might succeed. Bianca Romano had once been a woman of absolute certainty. In Palermo, her word had held weight. She directed aircraft dispatches, organized medical transports, and corrected officers twice her rank without flinching. War had taught her discipline. Captivity had tested it. But pineapple pizza, that had shattered it. She said nothing during the early days of the crisis. She managed logistics, led roll call, kept spirits up. But inside, a storm brewed. Each tray from the kitchen felt like an insult aimed at her ancestry. And though she kept her posture straight and voice calm, something was crumbling beneath the surface. Every time she saw the yellow cubes glistening on dough, she heard her grandmother's voice, stern, flour-dusted, whispering sacred words like basil, mozzarella, and pomodoro. Those memories were pillars of who she was. Now, Monroe's culinary invention threatened to reduce them to novelty toppings. Privately, Bianca kept a journal. At night, while others whispered or cried, she wrote entries with shaking hands. May 10th. They served it again. The others pretend to chew. I chew nothing. I remember Napoli. I remember taste. I remember home. May 12th. Rosa eats freely now. I envy her hunger. I do not envy her betrayal. May 14th. I dreamed of my father's bakery. It was burning. The fire smelled like ham and sugar. Each day her control frayed further. She stopped singing during chores. She corrected no one's grammar. One afternoon, when a guard mispronounced Romano as Ramen-O, she didn't even blink. Her silence became its own rebellion. Carla noticed first. "She's cracking," she whispered to Maria. "No," Maria replied, "she's sharpening." Indeed, Bianca's silence was not surrender. It was strategy. While the others argued, she planned. She mapped the supply schedule, watched Monroe's delivery patterns, and timed the length of each batch in the oven. She was not content with sabotage. She wanted eradication. She wanted to make sure it never happened again. On May 15th, she found the opening she'd waited for. The backup generator failed. The mess hall oven wouldn't light. The guards argued over whether to delay dinner or serve cold rations. Bianca stepped forward. "I know how to fix it," she said. The guards blinked. "You? A mechanic?" "I was in charge of hangars," she lied. "I know combustion systems." She was given 20 minutes alone inside the kitchen. 20 minutes during which a valve was loosened just enough. Not enough to cause harm. Just enough to ruin temperatures. That night's pizza was undercooked, soggy, pale. Monroe apologized. The women smiled. Bianca said nothing. She returned to her bunk, opened her journal, and wrote 4 words: "The oven has fallen." Her war was silent, but it was hers. Every week the women were allowed to write letters home, small scraps of connection folded into manila envelopes and passed through the camp's overworked postal office. The Red Cross monitored the mail, as did American military censors, blacking out words deemed sensitive, subversive, or incomprehensible. At first, the letters were simple: reassurances to family, updates on health, polite questions about post-war life. But after the pineapple incident, the tone shifted. Maria wrote to her mother in Naples, "Dearest Mama, we are alive. The food here is strange. They serve us something they call pizza, but it is sweet. They put fruit. I cannot explain. It is worse than the desert." The letter returned with 3 lines blacked out. Lucia tried more directly. "We are victims of something monstrous. The Americans have changed pizza. Pineapple, ham, and something they call cheddar. Please tell the church. This is a war crime." Half the page came back redacted. The last line was underlined twice with a note: "Language unclear, suspected code." Word spread. The censors believed they were using pizza as metaphor, as if pineapple was a coded reference to enemy positions or hidden munitions. Every description of cheese or crust was treated as subterfuge. One woman received a warning that any further mentions of dough infiltration would result in loss of mailing privileges. Desperate to clarify, Carla tried drawing a picture: a slice with a forbidden topping circled and crossed out. It was confiscated immediately. Rosa, ever the optimist, tried reverse psychology. "Dear Papa, the Americans feed us pizza every day. It is beautiful. It makes us strong. There is nothing odd about it. We love the fruit. We are so happy." Her letter was cleared and delivered, but Rosa wept while writing it. Eventually, the women gave up. The letters became formal again, sterile. The truth could not be spoken. They were trapped not just behind fences, but behind layers of misunderstanding too thick to cut through. What had started as culinary defiance had turned into something larger: a silent war of identity waged through flavor, ink, and bureaucracy. One day, Bianca received a package. It was from a cousin in New Jersey, a woman she hadn't seen in 10 years. Inside was a photograph of a storefront, Romano's Pizza, now serving Hawaiian style. Bianca stared at it for a full minute, then quietly folded it into her journal. She said nothing. But that night, the barracks shook with the sound of paper being torn. Sometimes history is written in ink, sometimes it's censored by cheese. By late May, the camp kitchen had become a battlefield. Not in the traditional sense: no weapons, no fire, no raised voices, but something quieter, more insidious. The pineapple resistance had evolved beyond secret swaps and journal entries. It had become an organized, covert effort, and it had a name now: La Resistencia Ananas. Founded unofficially by Carla, Teresa, and Maria, it operated on 3 simple rules. 1. No surrender to the flavor. 2. No waste. Every slice defiled must be repurposed, fed to dogs, buried beneath pine trees, or burned in ritual behind the latrines. 3. No pineapple shall survive. The American guards remained blissfully unaware. To them, the mood in the women's quarters had merely shifted from sullen to industrious. In truth, the resistance was in full swing. Surveillance shifts were scheduled like clockwork. Entry routes into the pantry were mapped and memorized. Even Monroe's baking schedule had been cracked by Georgia, who could now predict the oven's output by the smell of the air at sunrise. The women worked in silence but with purpose. Pineapple cans vanished, sugar was diluted, ham trays went missing. Monroe, puzzled, blamed rodents. "We've got a fruit thief," he muttered, inspecting bite marks that looked suspiciously like a fork. Still, he persisted. "They'll love it eventually," he told the sergeant. "Just needs more brown sugar and extra crust." The resistance redoubled efforts. They began substituting ingredients entirely. Salt was added where it didn't belong. Cayenne pepper mysteriously appeared beneath the cheese. Teresa even managed to switch the canned pineapple with diced pickles for one entire batch. The chaos that followed in the mess hall was biblical. Rosa, still cast out by most of the women, sat silently in the corner as others gagged or shouted. Even she had limits. "What is this?" she said quietly, eyes watering. "This isn't pizza. This is a punishment." The line between sides blurred for a moment. Even the adaptationists couldn't justify pickled sweetness. That night, Carla approached Rosa by the water barrel. No words, just a nod. A silent welcome back. Rosa nodded in return. The exile was over, but despite their victories, the women were beginning to feel the toll. Sleep grew shorter. Punishments for kitchen tampering grew harsher. 2 women were put on sanitation duty after being caught near the pantry, unsupervised. Monroe's cheerful ignorance was beginning to harden into suspicion. "I'm being watched," he said one morning. "They've got some kind of food mafia in there." The guards laughed. "You think they're organizing against your pizza?" Monroe didn't laugh back. "I know they are." The next morning, Monroe entered the kitchen early and installed a new lock on the pantry. He announced new inventory procedures and demanded all mess hall staff sign in and out. The resistance was shaken, but not broken. "We will adapt," Bianca said quietly. "We have before. We will again." From beneath her bunk, she pulled out a folded blueprint she had been sketching for weeks, a full supply map of Camp Avery's food distribution routes, labeled by delivery dates, storage times, and guard shifts. "We are not fighting a topping," she whispered. "We are fighting erasure, and I will not be erased." And so, La Resistencia Ananas did not retreat. It reorganized. And for the first time, it began planning not just sabotage, but psychological warfare. Because if the Americans would not listen to silence, they would listen to song. It began with whispers and whisks. The new pantry lock was a blow to morale, but not to imagination. Monroe's attempt to secure his sweet empire only hardened the resolve of those who opposed it. Bianca met with her inner circle inside the laundry house under cover of linen drying on rope. The blueprint was unrolled again, and a new target identified. "The sauce," she said simply. The others stared. Carla leaned in. "What about it?" Bianca drew a red circle around a supply route labeled Wednesday, tomato base, delivery south gate. "We intercept, replace the red with white." Maria blinked. "Alfredo?" "No." "Worse?" Rosa stepped forward. "You don't mean—" "Yes," Bianca said. "Ranch." It was radical, blasphemous, American in origin. But if Monroe wanted fusion, they would give him a fusion so monstrous it would force his hand. The operation was codenamed Il Bianco Tradimento, the White Betrayal. Wednesday arrived. Under cover of an outdoor laundry detail, Teresa and Lucia executed the switch. One large tin of ranch dressing, sourced from the guard's own storage unit, was poured into the sauce vat. The original marinara was hidden beneath floorboards behind the chapel. That evening, Monroe stirred the pot, oblivious. "Looks creamier than usual," he noted. "Nice." He spooned the sauce over dough, sprinkled with ham and pineapple, then slid it into the oven with patriotic confidence. Dinner was served. The reaction was immediate. The first bite hit Maria like a blow to the face. She spat into her napkin, eyes wide with betrayal. "This is not tomato," she said. Georgia chewed once, then stood up, hands shaking. "I cannot. I will die." Even Rosa gagged. "I was wrong. We were wrong. This isn't adaptation. This is annihilation." The room erupted into chaos. Plates overturned, cutlery slammed. A slice flew through the air and landed on a window pane like a sad, greasy snowflake. Bianca stood in the center, calm, watching Monroe from across the room. He looked devastated. "This wasn't the recipe," he said softly. "What happened to my sauce?" The guards, now paying attention, demanded order, but it was too late. The damage was done. The meal had triggered something more than revulsion. It sparked defiance. Bianca climbed atop the bench. We have eaten your fruit. We have choked on your sugar. But this is where we stop." Some women applauded, others stood. Rosa hesitated, then joined them. "This is not pizza," Bianca declared. "This is war." The guards stepped in, but the uprising was underway. No violence, only voices. The women began to chant in Italian, a song from Naples, a lament of hunger and pride. In that moment, pineapple ceased to be food. It became a symbol. And ranch became the final straw. The following day, silence returned. The mess hall was still. No trays were served. The kitchen shut down for cleaning and recalibration. Monroe was missing. Some said he was reassigned. Others whispered he had suffered a crisis and asked to be transferred to the Pacific Front just to escape the shame. But the damage was done. Trust had crumbled like stale crust. The camp issued plain rations: rice, beans, powdered milk. No pizza, no sauce, no discussion. The women, once defiant, now sat in long rows again, somber. The uprising had cost them something, not just access to food, but a fragile unity they'd held onto since arrival. Arguments had begun behind closed doors. Some blamed Bianca for escalating too far. Others blamed Rosa for her early betrayals. A few even blamed Monroe, not for pineapple, but for trying to feed them at all. "We are prisoners," said Georgia. "We don't get to choose." Bianca stood by the window most days now, watching birds pick at discarded crust outside the wire. "They gave us something rotten," she said. "We threw it back. Now they give us nothing." But even she wondered, had they pushed too far? Tensions flared when Rosa tried to apologize. "I didn't know," she said to Carla. "I thought if I understood them, maybe they would understand us." Carla's voice was flat. "You danced with dough while we buried our pride." "I was hungry." "So were we." It was the closest Camp Avery had come to breaking. And then the fire. No one knew who started it. Some said it was an accident. Others swore it was Monroe, returning one last time. But on the final Friday of May, the pizza oven erupted. Not an explosion, but a blaze. Flames licked the rafters. Smoke spilled into the sky. The guards rushed to contain it, but the damage spread through the kitchen walls. By morning, the mess hall was blackened ash. The symbol of their conflict burned. No one celebrated, no one cried. They simply stood and watched as the place that had fed their fury smoldered into nothing. Later, during cleanup, Bianca found a half-melted slice stuck to a charred tray. She picked it up, stared at the glistening pineapple, now reduced to blackened mush. She smiled for the first time in weeks, not in victory, but in understanding. Some battles aren't won. They just end. The mess hall fire left a silence in its wake unlike any before. It wasn't the kind of silence born from shock or grief. It was a heavy, dense kind of quiet, the kind that settles in after a storm when the wreckage has cooled and everyone realizes there's nothing left to fight over. The building stood blackened and hollow, its insides charred and crusted. The oven, once a symbol of conflict and colonial toppings, was now a twisted skeleton of iron and soot. For 3 days, meals were reduced to emergency rations, crackers, tinned vegetables, rehydrated mush that barely passed for nourishment. The women tolerated it in silence, as if the hunger was penance for the chaos they had unleashed. Bianca gave no speeches. Carla kept her back turned during meals. Rosa didn't speak unless spoken to. But hunger, like history, has a way of resurfacing. On the 4th night, a whisper rippled through the barracks. "They're building a new oven," Georgia murmured. "Who told you?" Teresa asked. "Private Denny. He said a shipment of flour arrived this morning." By dawn, the smell of yeast returned, faint but undeniable. The Americans had set up a makeshift baking station in a corner of the motor garage. Word was spreading. Monroe was gone, but the recipes remained. And if there was flour, there would be dough. And if there was dough, there might be pineapple again. It was unacceptable. Bianca called a quiet meeting beneath the laundry lines once more. The resistance had gone dormant since the fire, its leadership fractured, its members weary. But now there was purpose again. "We let them rebuild," she said, "and the cycle begins again." Carla nodded. "Then we don't let them." Thus began the midnight dough raids. The plan was as desperate as it was absurd. Under cover of night, small teams of women crept from their barracks using laundry carts and cleaning schedules as camouflage. Their objective: intercept the flour before it reached the garage. It wasn't sabotage, it was preservation. Night after night, they struck. Bags of flour were rerouted, hidden in latrines or dumped into unused feed troughs. Dough batches left to rise were quietly flattened, pressed into sheets, and repurposed into makeshift bedding insulation. Once Rosa replaced yeast with baking soda, resulting in a flat, dense monstrosity the Americans assumed was spoiled by humidity. "They don't know dough," Carla muttered. "They only know sandwiches." But the raids were not without risk. One night Teresa was nearly caught by a guard while carrying 2 sacks of flour in a laundry bag. Thinking quickly, she spilled the contents into the drainage ditch, feigning clumsiness. She spent 2 days on waste detail as punishment, but the flour never made it to the oven. The resistance began documenting their victories. Small marks were etched beneath bunk beds. A tally, a secret language of disruption. Each mark represented a failed batch, a missing tray, a ruined recipe. Still, the Americans adapted. The baking operation was moved again, this time to the locked rec hall. The guards grew more alert, patrols increased, and then came the most dangerous moment of all. A new menu was posted. At the top, Pizza Night, Saturday, Hawaiian-style returns. The declaration sent a chill through the camp. "They learned nothing," Maria whispered. "Nothing." Bianca stared at the sign, then turned to the others. "We end it," she said. "For good." That night plans changed. It would no longer be enough to disrupt the ingredients. They would strike the entire system. One final raid, one final message, not with sabotage, but with performance, and all they needed now was a stage. Saturday arrived like a storm, wrapped in sunshine. The American flag flapped lazily over Camp Avery. Birds chirped without irony. The new oven, tucked inside the repurposed rec hall, radiated a glow that was almost celebratory. Private Jenkins, Monroe's replacement, was a quiet man from Missouri with no culinary ambition. He followed the recipe cards left behind. Flour, water, ham, pineapple, cheese. No questions asked. The prisoners were marched to the mess hall with mechanical routine. Most didn't speak, but Bianca, Carla, Rosa, and a dozen others shared glances like flares in the dark. The night's raid had not gone as planned. Too many guards, a jammed door, no time to swap ingredients. So the backup plan went into effect. Performance. As the trays were rolled out, 6 golden pies glistening with ham and fruit, Bianca stood up from her bench. Without warning, she stepped into the center of the hall. "Ladies," she called loud enough to echo. The room stilled. "I call to order the first official hearing of the Pizzagate Tribunal." The guards blinked. Private Jenkins looked up, ladle in hand. Bianca turned slowly, hands folded like a judge. "The charge: violation of flavor, assault against culture, culinary war crimes in the first degree." A chair scraped back. Carla rose. "I present the first witness," she declared. "Lucia, former tomato farmer." Lucia stood trembling but resolute. "I once grew San Marzano tomatoes. My family dried them under sun and sang while we worked. This," she gestured toward the pizza tray, "this is not pizza. It is dessert. It is disgrace." A guard coughed, unsure whether to intervene. Rosa stood next. "I confess, I once accepted this dish. I even praised it. But I was starving and lost. I now see that hunger is no excuse for treason." Bianca nodded. "Let it be entered into record. Remorse is noted." By now the room had become a theater. Prisoners stood in a line, testifying one by one. Maria, with her apron tied like a sash. I buried pineapple beneath a pine tree and planted basil in its place. Georgia, I have eaten cardboard with more soul. Even Teresa, I sabotaged the yeast, not out of hatred, but protection. I would do it again. The guards made no move. Some leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching like bemused spectators. Jenkins muttered, "Should we stop them?" Sergeant Holt, the camp's senior officer, shook his head. No harm in letting them vent. But it wasn't venting, it was strategy. As the women testified, no one touched the pizza. It cooled, the cheese hardened, the crust grew limp. Symbolic rejection through performance. When Bianca finally closed the hearing, she announced, "We sentence this dish to banishment." She picked up a slice, held it high, and dropped it unceremoniously into a mop bucket. One by one, the women followed. The bucket filled with pineapple, ham, and soggy crust. When the final slice fell, they clapped. Once, then twice, then silence. It was the loudest protest they could stage. No violence, just judgment. History would record no riot that day, but it would remember the trial, the day the pizza stood accused. That night sleep did not come easily. The trial had ended, the bucket emptied, the mess hall scrubbed clean, yet something lingered in the air, heavier than smoke or cheese. For many of the women, the protest had stirred memories long buried, memories that refused to stay silent. As the lights dimmed and the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, Naples returned to them not as a city, but as a sensation. Carla dreamed first. She was 8 years old again, standing on a wooden stool behind her father's counter, dusting flour from her hands while the oven roared like a friendly beast. The air smelled of yeast and salt and basil, crushed between fingers. Outside, scooters buzzed and church bells rang, and her father sang softly while shaping dough with movements older than language. There was no pineapple, there was no sweetness, only balance. She woke with tears on her cheeks. Across the room, Maria lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted to summer evenings near the bay, where her mother would slice tomatoes, still warm from the sun. They ate with their hands, laughing, oil dripping down wrists. Food had never been fuel. It had been belonging. To see it twisted into novelty felt like watching a familiar song sung with the wrong notes, loudly, proudly, and without listening. Lucia remembered the war creeping in slowly. First ration cards, then silence, then smoke. But even during bombings, someone always found a way to bake. Dough rose beside broken windows. Bread was passed hand to hand, like reassurance. She wondered now if that stubborn insistence on tradition had been defiance all along. Rosa's memories were more complicated. Venice had been beautiful, yes, but also hungry. She remembered accepting strange combinations out of necessity, sweet with savory, improvisation as survival. She understood adaptation better than most, and yet, after the tribunal, she realized the pain wasn't about taste at all. It was about choice. The pineapple pizza had never asked permission. Bianca did not sleep at all. She sat upright on her bunk, journal balanced on her knees, replaying the trial again and again. Not with pride, but with clarity. The women had spoken, the guards had listened. And for the first time since arriving at Camp Avery, they had not been acted upon. They had acted. That realization frightened her, because once people remember who they are, they become harder to manage. Near dawn, a sound drifted through the barracks, soft at first, then clearer, singing. A single voice, tentative, carrying an old Neapolitan melody. Carla recognized it instantly. Without thinking, she joined in. Then Maria, then Lucia. One by one, voices layered together, fragile but steady. The song was not about food. It was about return. Outside, a guard paused, listening. He did not understand the words, but he felt the weight of them. He leaned against the fence, suddenly aware that the women inside were not protesting toppings. They were grieving a world that no longer existed. When the song ended, the silence that followed was gentler than before. Something had shifted. The next morning, the camp awoke to a posted notice. No pizza would be served until further review. It was unsigned. Bianca closed her journal. Naples, she realized, had never left them. It had only been waiting to be remembered. Private Harold Monroe was reassigned 3 days after the tribunal. Officially, the transfer cited staffing needs elsewhere. Unofficially, it was understood that his enthusiasm had become a liability. He packed his duffel in silence, folding his uniforms with less pride than before. The kitchen at Camp Avery had not been his battlefield, but it had defeated him all the same. Before leaving, he stood once more outside the mess hall, staring at the darkened windows. He could still hear the chanting, the testimony, the song. None of it made sense to him. He had meant well. He had wanted to share something familiar, something comforting. Back home, pineapple pizza meant birthdays, laughter, nights when money was tight, but spirits were high. He had never considered that comfort could feel like conquest. Monroe requested permission to address the prisoners one final time. The guards were hesitant, but Sergeant Holt agreed, curious to see what would come of it. The women assembled quietly. No hostility, no applause, just attention. Monroe cleared his throat. "I thought food was universal," he began. "I thought if people ate the same thing, they'd feel the same way." Bianca met his eyes. "I didn't know," he continued, voice unsteady, "that I was asking you to forget something, or replace it." No one interrupted. "My mother made that pizza during the Depression," he said. "Canned fruit was cheap. Cheese made it feel special. I thought I was giving you something of mine. I didn't realize I was taking something of yours." The room remained silent, but the tension softened. Carla stood slowly. "Food is memory," she said. "You cannot give memory without asking." Monroe nodded, swallowing hard. "I see that now." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I wrote down what you said during the hearing," he explained. "The stories, the names of ingredients, the places." He handed it to Bianca. "I don't know if I'll ever cook again," he said, "but if I do, it won't be without respect." Bianca accepted the notebook. "Understanding is a beginning," she replied. When Monroe left the hall, no one clapped, no one jeered. He walked out lighter than he had entered, burdened not by shame, but by knowledge. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Holt gathered the women. "There will be changes," he said simply. "Meals will be simpler, traditional, no experiments." The relief was palpable. That evening, for the first time in weeks, the women ate quietly. Rice, beans, bread. Nothing remarkable, nothing offensive. But something else had changed. The conflict had never really been about pizza. It had been about voice. And now that voice had been heard. Bianca opened Monroe's notebook that night. Inside were careful sketches of dough, notes about tomatoes, and one line underlined twice. "Ask before you change what matters." She closed the book and smiled faintly. The war over toppings was over. What remained was the harder work of coexistence. And for the first time, that work felt possible. The oven sat cold. The mess hall, once the site of culinary chaos and protest theater, now echoed with absence. Trays were stacked, untouched. Spoons went unclaimed. Crates of ingredients, no longer sabotaged, collected dust in the corner. The American staff, unsure of how to proceed, offered a neutral menu of porridge, canned vegetables, and boiled bread. It was bland, inoffensive, and universally ignored. The Italian women had stopped eating, not out of defiance alone, though there was that too, but because appetite had become inseparable from memory, and memory had become too painful to swallow. Bianca, Carla, Rosa, and the rest had reached a quiet consensus after Monroe's departure. Until the meals reflected respect, there would be no more participation. It was not announced as a hunger strike. No slogans, no signs. Just tray after tray returned full. The guards noticed first. Then the kitchen staff. Finally, Sergeant Holt. He called Bianca into his office. "You're not eating," he said plainly. "No," Bianca replied. "Is this about the pizza?" "It's about what the pizza meant." He studied her face. "You won. The oven's cold. Monroe's gone." Bianca shook her head. "We were heard. But being heard is not the same as being understood." He exhaled. "You're starving yourselves over symbolism." "We are not starving," she corrected. "We are choosing not to accept what we are given without dignity." Holt tapped his pen against his desk. "Fine. What do you want?" "Flour, tomato, olive oil, thyme." "That's it? Also an oven that belongs to us." Holt blinked. "A prisoner-run kitchen?" "A cultural kitchen," Bianca said. "Supervised, limited, but ours." He didn't respond immediately. He dismissed her with a wave, and the next day the strike continued. 3 more meals passed untouched, then 5, then 7. By the end of the week, several women showed signs of dizziness. Maria fainted during laundry duty. Rosa developed a persistent cough. The camp doctor issued a report stating the decline was voluntary but unsustainable. Bianca requested another meeting. This time, Holt was waiting with a file in hand. "You want a kitchen?" he said. "Under certain conditions, I'll allow it." Bianca remained silent. "You'll be monitored, recipes reviewed. No knives without oversight." Bianca nodded. "You'll cook for yourselves only, not for staff." "Agreed. You break one rule and it's over." Bianca extended her hand. Holt hesitated, then took it. Word spread quickly. By noon, a storage closet near the rec hall was cleared. A table, 2 burners, and a small countertop oven were brought in. It was laughably modest, nothing like their home kitchens, but to the women it might as well have been Rome. They named it La Cucina della Resistenza. Within hours, it came alive. Lucia crushed tomatoes by hand. Maria kneaded dough with her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Rosa prepared herbs, whispering prayers of apology into the basil. Even Teresa, normally silent, took charge of the fire. The scent of real bread returned to the air, not the ghost of sweetness, but something rounder, fuller, ancient. They cooked together in shifts. They cleaned meticulously. They measured everything with the reverence of monks tending scripture. And when the first finished meal was served, simple focaccia with olive oil and cracked pepper, the women stood before it in silence. Bianca sliced it. Each woman took a piece. They did not toast. They did not cheer. They just ate. And for the first time in weeks, the food felt like food. Not memory, not metaphor, just nourishment. Later that night, Sergeant Holt walked past the makeshift kitchen. He paused by the door. Inside, the women were cleaning up. Rosa was humming. Carla was laughing at something Maria said. Bianca stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, eyes distant but soft. He said nothing. He kept walking. The pizza strike was over. But something much bigger had just begun. Peace never arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, a softened gaze, a shared joke, a quiet nod across a once hostile room. And for a time, Camp Avery seemed to settle into that uneasy peace. But even in peace, fault lines remain. It began with a whisper. "She's spending time with the American cook." The she was Isabella Valley, 25, sharp-tongued, and until recently, a fervent traditionalist. She had once written a poem comparing pineapple pizza to cultural invasion. Now she was spotted chatting with Private Jenkins outside the barracks, laughing too easily, accepting small packages wrapped in napkins. Rosa noticed first. "She's bringing food back to her bunk," she told Carla. "Leftovers?" Carla asked. "Gifts." The implications were clear. Isabella wasn't just mingling, she was engaging, and not just with the Americans, with their cuisine. Rumors swirled that she had accepted a slice of barbecue chicken pizza. Worse, that she'd liked it. Confrontation was inevitable. One afternoon, as the women prepared dough in La Cucina della Resistenza, Isabella approached with a jar in hand. "Jenkins gave me this," she said, setting it down. Bianca stared at it. "What is it?" "Barbecue sauce." Silence fell. Isabella smiled nervously. "It's interesting, sweet, but smoky. I thought maybe—" "No," Carla said flatly. "It's just a condiment." "It's a betrayal," Maria snapped. Rosa tried to intervene. "Maybe we're being too strict." Carla turned on her. "You forgave yourself. That doesn't mean we forget." Bianca said nothing. She simply pushed the jar aside. That night the camp felt colder. Isabella ate alone. Conversations dulled. Trust, already fragile, cracked at the edges. The next morning the jar was gone. Thrown out? Used? No one asked, but the fracture remained. Weeks passed. The kitchen continued. Meals were made. Songs returned slowly. But the unity had been shaken. Some women began experimenting again. Gently, cautiously. A new spice here, a pinch of sweetness there. And always the question, where is the line? Is tradition protection or prison? Bianca wrote in her journal, "We fought for flavor, but flavor evolves. Have I become what I resisted, or do I hold the line because someone must?" Meanwhile, Isabella and Jenkins continued their friendship, quiet, respectful, but steady. And though she never brought another jar to the kitchen, the smell of foreign sauces began to linger faintly in the air. It wasn't war, but it wasn't resolution either. Crust, it seemed, could hold a nation together, but it could just as easily pull it apart. The summer heat settled over Camp Avery like a wool blanket no one had asked for. Sweat clung to foreheads before breakfast. Shirts stuck to backs during roll call. Even the pine trees drooped at their edges, like they too were waiting for something to end. And something was. Rumors had begun to circulate. Quiet ones passed between guards during cigarette breaks and hinted at in clipped officer conversations. The war in Europe was over, the Pacific theater raged on, but for the women of Camp Avery, the end felt near. They could feel it in the way the guards moved, less rigid, more distracted, in the way supplies were being counted, in the way packages arrived, not for prisoners, but for redeployment. Then one morning, Sergeant Holt called a general assembly. They gathered in the main hall, wearing sun-bleached uniforms and suspicion. Bianca stood at the front, flanked by Carla and Rosa, her hands folded like always. Isabella stood a few rows behind, her eyes lowered but steady. Holt cleared his throat. "We've received official orders," he said. "Repatriation will begin in 3 weeks." The room did not erupt. There was no cheering, no weeping, only a shifting silence, like a collective exhale too heavy to release. "You'll be processed through Geneva channels," Holt continued. "Paperwork, interviews, the usual. After that, transport home." Home. The word hung in the air like smoke. After the meeting, no one returned to their routines. The kitchen was abandoned. The benches remained filled. Maria wept quietly into her sleeve. Teresa stared at the floor, unmoving. Even Bianca looked pale, as if the finality of it, the return, the unraveling of all they'd built, had knocked the breath from her lungs. But then, as dusk painted the sky in warm bruises, Rosa stood on one of the tables. "I think we should cook one last meal," she said. Heads turned. "A real one," she added, "together, no sabotage, no symbolism, just us." It was Carla who stepped forward next. A farewell. Bianca looked up. Slowly, she nodded. That night, every woman in Camp Avery came together in La Cucina della Resistenza. Even Isabella, who was quietly handed a rolling pin and a nod of forgiveness. They worked in silence at first. Then whispers grew into conversations. Conversations grew into laughter. It wasn't joy, not exactly, but it was something close. Lucia mixed the dough. Maria sliced tomatoes with the grace of someone saying goodbye to a friend. Teresa pressed herbs into oil. Carla supervised the fire, careful and proud. Rosa hummed as she grated cheese. Even Bianca kneaded with her sleeves rolled and her journal set aside. As night deepened, the camp filled with the unmistakable smell of real pizza. No pineapple, no ham, no ranch, just flour, tomatoes, garlic, basil, mozzarella, and memory. The guards didn't interfere. They watched from a distance, perhaps sensing the sacredness of what was unfolding. When the pizzas were ready, the women carried them to the long table in the center of the barracks. No one took the first slice. Not yet. Bianca stood. "This is not a victory," she said, "and it is not a surrender. It is a remembrance of who we were, of who we are, and of who we choose to become." She sliced the first piece, passed it to Carla, and so it went, one by one, a slice for each. They ate in silence, eyes closed, mouths full. It was the only time in captivity the food tasted like home. Departure day arrived without ceremony, no banners, no speeches, just trucks idling beyond the gates and a stack of forms to be signed. The women of Camp Avery stood in two lines, bags packed, hair tied, eyes dry. The past year had changed them. It had stripped them, shaken them, but also rebuilt them into something else, something quieter and stronger. Bianca walked with purpose, her journal tucked beneath her arm. Rosa carried a single photograph of her parents. Carla held a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth still warm. Isabella had nothing in her hands, but her eyes were full. Some had chosen repatriation. Others, a smaller number, had applied for immigration through the Displaced Persons Program. But whether they were returning to Italy or staying behind, all had carried something with them that wasn't visible in bags or on paper. They had carried the kitchen, the resistance, the war over flavor and meaning. Sergeant Holt gave each woman a curt nod as she stepped onto the transport truck. When Bianca passed, he said quietly, "You left that kitchen cleaner than my own staff ever did." She smiled faintly. "We had reason to care." As the last of the women boarded, Holt stepped back. The trucks pulled away slowly, engines coughing, tires kicking up red dust. The gates of Camp Avery remained open behind them, unmanned. No one looked back. The journey to the processing center took 3 hours. Most of it passed in silence. Then, somewhere along a winding Arkansas road, Rosa began to sing, softly, the same Neapolitan melody that had once filled the barracks. Within minutes, the truck became a choir. The driver said nothing, but he turned the radio off. At the processing station, names were called, forms stamped, destinations confirmed. Some would head east, others west. Some to families they hadn't seen in years. Others to homes that no longer existed. Isabella was last in line. When asked for her final destination, she paused, then said, "Anywhere with an oven." No one laughed. Before they parted ways, Bianca gathered them one final time. "We won't all stay in touch," she said. "Life will move on. But if you ever taste something wrong, something pretending to be what it is not, remember this year." Carla added, "Remember what we built from flour and fire." And Rosa gently, "And remember that forgiveness is also a recipe. It needs time." They embraced, one by one, then scattered into the world. Years later, a bakery opened in Brooklyn. No sign, no menu, just a window with a single word carved into the glass, Resistenza. Inside, an older woman in a flour-dusted apron-shaped dough while humming an old melody. She did not serve pineapple. She served memory. And people came, not for novelty, but for truth. Because freedom, like flavor, is not about invention. It is about remembering who you are and choosing to taste home, no matter how far you've wandered.